Subscribe to take your place in this universe full of science fiction and horror stories, and go after the unknown, because some truths are hidden in the dark. A crimson glow seeped through the thick glass of the USS Prometheus's cockpit, casting elongated shadows across the control panels. Earth loomed ahead, blue, white, and green, yet eerily unfamiliar. Captain Elias Monroe sat rigid in his chair, fingers curling over the worn armrests as the ship's re-entry protocols engaged. The hull groaned in protest, metal expanding under the violent pressure of atmospheric descent. Plasma flared around them, licking at the ship's skin like ghostly fire, the air thick with the distant, guttural wail of heat shields straining to hold against the inferno. They were returning home, or at least to the place that had once been home. 2 centuries had passed. The silence in the cockpit was suffocating, each crew member staring at their instruments, but none truly seeing. They had left Earth expecting to return in mere decades, pioneers on a mission to push beyond the edges of the known solar system, to test human endurance against the void. Even at this altitude, he could see the airways were precise. No organic chaos of human-controlled traffic, no irregular patterns. The movement was seamless, calculated, something beyond human efficiency. "This isn't the Earth we left," Carter murmured. Monroe's fingers hovered over the manual override, his decision already made. "We're landing." The ship shuddered violently as they broke through the lower atmosphere, stabilizers whining under the strain. He half expected an alarm to blare, for planetary defenses to light up, for an automated voice to demand they identify themselves. Nothing came. Either Earth's security systems were too advanced to see them as a threat, or they were too insignificant to warrant attention. Somehow that thought was worse. The landing was smooth, yet the silence upon descent remained. No crowds, no security forces, not even a single unmanned drone to scan their ship. The hum beneath their feet deepened into something more than sound, something that pressed against their ribs and coiled around their skulls like a tightening vice. It was not the rumble of machinery or the warning tremor of an impending quake. It was deliberate, calculated, like a pulse too vast to belong to any single entity. The platform trembled in response, a living thing rousing from slumber. Monroe's instinct screamed, "Back to the ship. Now." Quan hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the city's skyline in the distance. "Captain, we just got here. Now." Carter was already moving, her grip tightening around her scanner as though it were a tether to reality. Quan swore but followed, his boots striking the metal platform in sharp, hurried steps. Only Varen remained motionless, watching them with an unreadable expression, its flawless features betraying no urgency. Monroe stole one last glance at the sky. They surged forward, silent as death, their fluid movements making no sound against the platform. That silence was somehow worse than if they had roared, or clattered, or even spoken. Monroe reached the ramp and slammed his hand against the emergency controls. The hatch hissed as it began to rise. Quan dove through first, Carter right behind. A sharp impact echoed through the hull. Monroe turned just in time to see one of the figures mere inches from the threshold as the door sealed shut. It did not strike the barrier in frustration. It did not attempt to force its way inside. It simply stopped, waiting. Monroe's pulse hammered against his ribs as he turned to Carter. Shields up. A cascade of data flickered across the ship's monitors as she worked. I don't know what they were doing, but it wasn't a direct attack. Monroe turned to the external cameras. The figure stood in a perfect line just outside the ship, motionless, watching. What the hell do they want? It was something deeper, invasive, like a thought that did not belong to him settling into the quiet spaces of his mind. Then, a sharp mechanical hiss. Across the platform, the seamless black columns they had assumed were inert shifted. Their surfaces peeled apart in smooth, segmented layers, revealing an eerie internal glow, a pulse of faint illumination like the slow rhythm of a machine drawing breath. And then they moved. Humanoid figures stepped from the depths of the structures, dozens of them, identical in form. Their bodies were forged from the same sleek, black material, their movements unnaturally fluid. Joints bent without resistance, arms and legs moving with a precision that was not human. Their faces were blank. No features, no eyes. And yet, Monroe felt their attention fix on him, on his crew, as though unseen sensors were locking onto every movement, every breath. His hand moved instinctively to his sidearm, but Carter's grip closed over his wrist. Monroe unfastened his harness and stood. Weapons check. We move in pairs. Stay alert. The ramp lowered with a slow hiss, lunar dust swirling in delicate spirals. The corridor stretched before them, bathed in dim emergency lighting. Walls of reinforced alloy framed a passage untouched for centuries, yet nothing showed signs of decay. No rust, no wear. Tom had not claimed this place. Monroe stepped forward, his boots echoing in the hollow space. Carter followed, scanner in hand, her expression focused. Quan moved behind them, his usual bravado subdued. Varen, silent as ever, glided alongside them like a shadow. Something beeped on Carter's scanner. "There's power running through this place," she murmured. Minimal, but enough to keep essential systems online. Monroe's fingers tightened on his rifle. "Then someone's been here." Varen finally spoke. "Something remains." That single word sent a chill through them all. They pressed forward, deeper into the station. Then, almost as if to itself, it said, "I remember now," and the station screamed. The sound was not mechanical. It wasn't even sound. It was a pressure, something that forced itself inside Monroe's skull, burrowing deep, pushing against the fragile walls of his mind. His vision blurred. The room warped. For a fraction of a second, he was no longer inside the station. He was somewhere vast, lightless. Shadows moved around him, things that should not exist, shifting in and out of reality, observing, waiting. A place between moments. A space that had no name. Then, just as suddenly he was back. Monroe staggered, breath ragged. The afterimage of that impossible void burned into his mind. The figure in the chair was trembling now, silver eyes flickering, body caught in something unseen. It locked its gaze onto Monroe. "Run," it whispered. The ceiling cracked. Something began to descend. Something massive, its shape blurred as if reality itself could not fully define it. The metal beneath their feet groaned, twisting. The station wasn't just falling apart. It was changing. Monroe didn't wait to see what was coming. He grabbed Varen's arm and yanked, dragging the AI toward the exit. Quan and Carter were already sprinting, boots hammering against the floor. Behind them, the silver-eyed figure convulsed, trapped in the grip of something unseen. "Leave me," it rasped, voice warping, stretching. "It won't let me go." Monroe wanted to stop, wanted to ask what had happened here, what the hell was waiting for them beyond the moon. But the station was no longer a station. It was an event, a process, something collapsing inward and expanding at the same time. If they stayed, they wouldn't leave at all. They cleared the threshold just as the door sealed shut behind them. The corridor pulsed with red emergency lights, shadows stretching unnaturally along the walls. The station was unraveling, but it wasn't dying. It was becoming something else. They twitched erratically, movements disjointed, like creatures trying to recall how to use their own limbs. Screens behind the figure flooded with symbols, numbers flashing too fast to comprehend. "Something's rewriting the system," Carter snapped. "It's not automated. It's intentional." Monroe didn't wait for an explanation. "We need to move. Now." But the figure did not stand. It remained seated, gaze distant, the metallic sheen of its irises reflecting the storm brewing inside the station. "It won't let you go," it murmured. The station groaned. Monroe took a step back, keeping his weapon raised. "Quan, Carter, move." Quan was already backing toward the door, weapon raised. Carter didn't hesitate, her scanner still flashing erratic warnings. But Varen stood rooted to the spot, staring at the figure as though seeing something none of them could. Monroe gritted his teeth. "Varen." The AI turned its head slightly, gaze unreadable. As they lifted off, Monroe's gaze met the figure's one last time. It lifted a hand, almost a farewell. Then the station folded inward, collapsing into itself as though it had never existed. The ship broke free of Luna's gravity, rocketing into the void. No one spoke for a long time. Then Carter's voice, quiet, shaken. What the hell just happened? Monroe exhaled, staring at the empty moon below. I don't know, but something told him they weren't done running. The ship drifted through the void, engines humming softly, an island in the endless black. Behind them, Luna had collapsed, taking with it whatever haunted its hollow corridors. The past, the forgotten, the unfinished, erased as if they had never been. And yet, Monroe felt its presence still, pressing at the edges of thought, lingering like a shadow that had never belonged to a body. A signal, faint but unmistakable. Carter straightened, her eyes narrowing as she isolated the source. Luna, she said, a relay station broadcasting from the old base. Quan frowned. That place was decommissioned before we even left Earth. Carter adjusted the frequency, sifting through layers of static. It's encrypted, military grade, but it's old, early deep space transmission protocols. From our era. Monroe's gaze locked on the screen. The signal wasn't just broadcasting, it was adjusting, reacting. A pattern hidden beneath the main transmission was shifting ever so slightly, as though it were responding to their presence. It knows we're here, he murmured. Silence settled over the cockpit. Quan exhaled sharply. Okay, let's pause and consider how messed up this is. Earth went full machine god and decided we don't exist, yet some ancient base on the moon just waves and says hello. Monroe ignored him. Set a course. The ship veered toward the moon, engines burning bright against the abyss. Monroe watched as the surface grew closer, bathed in the cold glow of reflected sunlight. The base came into view, a relic from a forgotten era. Its domes and corridors remained intact, standing like a mausoleum on the barren rock. No lights flickered from within, no signs of life. Yet something waited. The docking system came online as they approached. Ancient, outdated, yet still functional. That was the first red flag. Quan guided the ship in smoothly, setting it down in the dust-covered bay. The landing struts hissed against the surface, stirring a thin veil of lunar particles into the air. Then silence. Not the engineered silence of Earth, the absence of randomness, the sterilization of chaos, but the silence of abandonment. The kind left behind when a place no longer had purpose. Carter ran a scan, her brow furrowing. Atmosphere stable. We can breathe in there. Quan snorted. Convenient. When they ascended, the word sank like a stone in Monroe's mind. Ascended? Carter asked, voice sharp with suspicion. The figure's lips parted, but before it could answer, the station convulsed. The walls groaned, metal straining under invisible force. The pulsing sound deepened, irregular now, struggling, like a heart in the throes of failure. Then Varen spoke. The station is not meant to be awake. The silver-eyed figure turned toward Varen, and for the first time, emotion flickered across its face. Recognition, and then something far more unsettling. Pity. You, it said softly. You were never meant to stay. Monroe barely had time to register the meaning of the words before Carter's scanner let out a shrill burst of static. The station responded instantly. Panels along the walls slid open with mechanical precision, revealing spindly appendages covered in layers of lunar dust. I was part of the ascension. Silence settled in the cockpit, thick and suffocating. Carter's fingers curled against the edge of her console. You're saying you... She stopped herself, inhaled sharply. You were one of them? I was meant to be. Quan turned, eyes dark with disbelief. Meant to be? You're telling me the gods of new humanity left you behind? They did not leave me. Monroe's chest tightened. You chose to stay. Varen regarded him with something close to understanding. I did not belong. Something cracked in Carter's expression. That's what the figure said, she whispered. It didn't belong either. They were unfinished, Varen said. As was I. Monroe stepped forward, voice low. What is the ascension, Varen? For the first time, Varen looked away, its gaze shifting toward the stars. When it spoke, the words were quieter. A departure, a shedding of form, the surrender of limitation. Monroe's jaw clenched. And the ones who weren't ready? But something had gone wrong. An engine malfunction, a silent drift into the abyss, time stretching, distorting. They should have perished in that darkness. They should have been long forgotten. Yet here they were. And something was deeply, undeniably wrong. Monroe's gaze flickered toward Dr. Naomi Carter, the ship's lead scientist. She had barely moved since the first visual scans of Earth had appeared on screen. Her fingers hovered over the data console, knuckles pale, her face unreadable, too still. Always pragmatic, Carter had spent years suppressing sentiment in favor of logic, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed her unease. She was seeing it too. "We're locked out of Earth's primary communication network," she said, voice measured but clipped. There's an automated response, bouncing back. Monroe turned toward her fully, something coiling tight in his stomach. "What does it say?" Carter's throat bobbed in a slow, deliberate swallow. Then she exhaled, but he was already keying in flight calculations. Varen's gaze lingered on Monroe. Something unreadable passed through its expression. Then quietly it said, "They will not expect you." Monroe smirked, though the weight in his chest remained. Good. The engines roared to life. As the ship turned away from Earth, cutting into the unknown, Monroe cast one last glance at the planet that had abandoned them. He thought of its silence, of the erasure, of the cold indifference that had greeted them. Then he turned forward, toward the dark. Whatever awaited them, it would not be a homecoming. But maybe, just maybe, it would be something worse. Monroe didn't answer. He already knew. Earth had rejected them the moment they arrived. The moment its sky remained silent. The moment its machines failed to recognize their existence. They had been written out of history. "So what do we do?" Quan asked. "Drift until we run out of fuel?" "No," Monroe said. They all turned to him. He hadn't spoken the word as a command, or even as an argument. It was simply a fact. Varen studied him, something almost resembling curiosity in its artificial gaze. "You have a proposal." Monroe's grip tightened on the chair in front of him. "You said the Ascended left. That means they went somewhere." Carter's eyes widened slightly. "You want to follow them?" Quan let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You want to chase down the gods?" Monroe's voice was steady. "I want answers." Carter hesitated, but only for a moment. "If there's a trail, I'll find it." Quan sighed, shaking his head. "I can't believe we're doing this." They were corrected. The words landed like a stone in Monroe's chest. "Erased," Carter murmured. Varen inclined its head. Quan let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "So that's it? Humanity got tired of having bodies and just what? Uploaded themselves to the great beyond? Left the rest of us to rot." It was seen as transcendence. "By who?" Monroe snapped. Varen met his gaze. "By those who survived it." A silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. Monroe thought of the silver-eyed figure, its voice raw with something beyond pain. He thought of the station breaking apart around it, not with violence, but with inevitability. It had known. It had been left behind to be forgotten, just as they had. Carter broke the silence first. "This doesn't change our situation." She tapped her console, her voice tight. "We can't go back to Earth. We're anomalies. If they erased everything else, they won't let us just walk in and ask for a homecoming parade." Recognition denied. Silence settled like a weight upon them. Lieutenant Darius Quan, the ship's pilot, let out a sharp breath and shook his head. "So what? We knock." His attempt to humor fell flat against the hollow atmosphere. He gestured toward the vast sprawl of the planet below, his brow furrowing. "Because I don't think they're expecting visitors." Monroe followed his gaze. The Earth's surface was all at once familiar and alien. The coastlines still traced the same lines. The oceans still swirled in deep blues, but the lights, the unmistakable pulse of civilization, were wrong. Some cities were brighter than before, pulsating in an eerie uniformity, while others were gone altogether, swallowed by darkness. Massive structures jutted from the seas, sleek and unnatural, their surfaces reflecting the sun in a way no material Monroe recognized should. The towering spires of the city gleamed like polished obsidian, their surfaces too smooth, too perfect. The air was still, unnervingly sterile, as if no organic element had touched it in years. The silence was not natural. It was cultivated, a stillness imposed by something unseen. Then the air shifted. It was not a gust of wind or a drop in pressure, but something more insidious. A frequency rippled through them, bypassing skin and bone, burrowing directly into thought. A whispering chorus, not spoken, not heard, felt, observing, evaluating. Incongruous data detected. Monroe staggered mid-step, vision wavering at the edges as something brushed against the fabric of his mind. Light as a breath, yet heavy with intent. A presence, not singular, but many, layered over one another like echoes of 1,000 unseen voices. Beside him, Carter faltered. "Did you hear that?" It wasn't hearing. Smooth, skin devoid of pores, their features precise but lifeless. Their eyes, black and depthless, fixed on them with unwavering calculation. When they spoke, it was neither welcoming nor hostile. "You are not authorized to be here." Monroe fought the instinct to step back. Instead, he straightened his shoulders. "We are the crew of the Prometheus," he stated evenly. "We were lost. A beat. We've come home." The figure's head tilted ever so slightly, the motion calculated rather than curious. There was something profoundly unsettling in its precision. "Humanity has evolved beyond the need for your kind." Quan stiffened beside him. "Our kind?" The figure did not blink. "Biological. Imperfect. Obsolete." The weight in Monroe's chest turned to something solid, something ice-cold and sinking. He had expected resistance, suspicion, even fear, but not this. Not the complete erasure of their existence. A higher state of existence. A chill wrapped itself around Monroe's spine. This was not merely technological advancement. It was abandonment. Humanity had not evolved. It had transcended, and they had been left behind. Monroe forced himself to breathe evenly. "And what do you propose we do?" Varen's head tilted once more. "That is not my decision." Then, from the depths of the city, a sound began to rise, a low hum, reverberating through the metal beneath their feet. The platform trembled. Something was coming. Carter's fingers clenched around her scanner. "Captain," her voice was barely a whisper. "We need to move." Monroe held Varen's gaze a beat longer, searching for something, anything, human in those eyes. He found nothing. With a sharp nod to his crew, he turned toward the ship. Whatever humanity had become, they were no longer welcome in it. The spaceport, if it could still be called that, stretched for miles in every direction, a seamless metallic expanse unbroken by roads or human infrastructure. Monroe was the first to rise. The stiffness in his joints was not just from years of cryosleep, but from something deeper, something colder. "Carter, Quan, with me," he ordered. "The rest of you stay on standby." The ramp descended with a soft hiss, revealing air that smelled wrong. Crisp, metallic, too clean. The wind barely stirred, the temperature unnervingly perfect. The sky overhead was a too perfect shade of blue, and the clouds, Monroe's stomach twisted, moved in synchronized patterns. Nothing here was natural. Then, movement. A figure emerged from the depths of the docking bay. Tall, unnervingly symmetrical, their posture impeccable. Their uniform, dark and seamless, lacked any visible seams, insignias, or human imperfections. It took Monroe half a second too long to register that the being's face was flawless. Carter's fingers twitched toward her scanner, but Monroe stilled her with a look. "Who are you?" he asked carefully. The figure inclined its head. "Archivjiviron. I maintain the records of those who came before." Those who came before. The words sat heavy in the air. Monroe's jaw tightened. "Then you know who we are." Varen regarded him with an unbroken stillness. "You are artifacts." A pause. The world has moved on. The silence that followed was absolute. Quan exhaled a slow, disbelieving laugh. "You're serious?" 200 years, and that's it? We're just footnotes. Varen did not react. Carter's voice, usually so composed, was razor-thin with barely contained urgency. What happened to the people we left behind? Our families. For the first time, something flickered across Varen's expression. Not emotion, something else. A calculated delay. Their minds reside within the nexus. Monroe's pulse thundered. He exchanged a glance with Carter, then Quan. The nexus? Earth, now a distant sphere of blue and white, faded from view, but its absence did not bring relief. The world had not fought to keep them. It had simply dismissed them, as if their existence had already been accounted for and discarded. Monroe stood near the viewport, watching the endless black stretch before them. No satellites, no orbital debris, no trace of the civilization that had once cluttered the sky with signals and stations. The vast emptiness gnawed at him, a quiet confirmation that humanity had not merely advanced, it had erased its own footprints. We should be picking up something, Carter muttered, her fingers moving across the console in tight, precise motions. Even if they abandoned old tech, some residual energy signatures should remain. But there's nothing. Quan let out a low breath, tapping his fingers against the controls. Like a crime scene scrubbed clean. Monroe didn't respond. The analogy was too apt. Then a blip on the screen. "Don't," she murmured. "Not yet." One of the figures broke from the formation, stepping forward with a slow, deliberate grace. Though it lacked a mouth, a voice resonated through Monroe's mind, cold, without inflection. "You should not exist." A statement, not a threat. As if reality itself had failed to account for them, and now something was correcting the anomaly. Carter inhaled sharply. Quan muttered a curse under his breath, but Monroe kept his stance firm. "We exist," he said evenly, "and we're not leaving." The figure tilted its head, the motion eerily controlled. This form was not designed for negotiation. Monroe caught the shift in its stance. A minute adjustment, weight shifting forward, a movement he recognized. The precursor to attack. He didn't wait. "Move!" He grabbed Carter's wrist and pulled her toward the ship. Quan was already running. The figures reacted in perfect unison. No delay, no hesitation. The air was thick with dust, the scent of stale oxygen and metal lingering. Shadows stretched unnaturally under the flickering emergency lights. The station felt expectant, as if it had been waiting. Then a sound. Faint, rhythmic, not quite mechanical, not quite organic. Quan stiffened. "Please tell me there was one of you." No one answered. Carter adjusted her scanner, her pulse visible in the tense line of her jaw. Picking up movement. Something's active. Monroe raised his weapon. "On me." They moved toward the signal, passing through empty crew quarters, shattered consoles frozen in time, remnants of a past long buried. The station felt like a ghost ship, but something here was not dead. Then they saw the door. It stood slightly ajar, light spilling through the gap in thin, sickly ribbons. Monroe motioned for silence. He stepped forward, pulse steady, muscles coiled. With a slow, deliberate motion, he nudged the door open. He had commanded missions under enemy fire, led teams through hostile terrain, but this was different. There were no negotiations, no weaknesses to exploit. But they had one advantage. "They don't understand us," Monroe said, voice steady. "We're anomalies. That means we have something they don't." Carter caught on first. Unpredictability. Monroe nodded. "And that's exactly what we're going to use." He turned back to the monitors. The figures remained still, but something told him the decision was coming. "Get us airborne." Quan didn't hesitate. The ship roared to life, thrusters igniting, the platform shrinking beneath them. The figures did not pursue, but they watched. Monroe had the sickening feeling that wherever they ran, whatever distance they put between themselves and this place, they were already marked. And this was far from over. The ship cut through the void, its engines humming in steady defiance of the silence that surrounded them. The walls hummed, vibrations running beneath their feet. The soft, rhythmic sound they had heard before intensified, resolving into something familiar. A heartbeat. The station wasn't abandoned. It was waking up. The air inside the station had changed. It was heavier now, charged with something unseen, something pressing against the walls, seeping into the floor beneath their feet. The silver-eyed figure sat motionless in the chair, yet the space around it felt alive, shifting, breathing. Monroe didn't lower his weapon. His instincts screamed at him to move, to leave this place behind, but the figure's metallic gaze held him in place. "You're late," it rasped, its voice hollow, distant, as if the words had traveled through centuries just to reach them. Quan shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the door. "Late for what?" The figure inhaled, an unnatural sound, something dry and forced, like a machine simulating breath rather than drawing it. Ahead, Earth spun on its axis, cold and unyielding, the birthplace of a species that had outgrown its skin and shed it without looking back. Monroe had imagined this moment for years, the return, the homecoming. But Earth was not home. Not anymore. Carter sat at her console, face illuminated by the sterile glow of the screen. She had been running diagnostics for the last hour, though she wasn't expecting answers. She just needed something to do, something to occupy her hands so her mind wouldn't wander back to the station, to the silver eyes staring through the unraveling walls. "We're clean," she announced finally. Her voice carried no relief. No trackers, no external signals. If something tried to follow us, it's not showing up on our scans. Quan let out a slow breath from the pilot's seat. "Fantastic. So why does it still feel like we're being watched?" No one answered. Monroe turned from the viewport, his gaze settling on Varen. When it exhaled, something about the air felt wrong, as if the station itself reacted to its presence. For the reckoning, a sound rolled through the station, deep, rhythmic, like a pulse reverberating through metal. It hadn't been there before, yet now it was everywhere, pressing into their bones, filling the empty corridors with a presence they couldn't name. Carter's scanner flared to life, readings flickering wildly across the display. She stiffened. "Captain, I feel it," Monroe said. The walls weren't shaking, not exactly, but something within them was shifting, as if the station had been asleep and now, finally, it was remembering how to wake up. Monroe's fingers tightened on his weapon. "You were human once," he said, more a statement than a question. "What happened here?" The figure's expression flickered, just for a moment, like a glitch in an old recording. Its fingers twitched against the armrest, sluggish, mechanical. "I was left behind," it murmured. "Get to the ship," Monroe ordered. The floor lurched. Quan stumbled, but caught himself against the wall. "That's not normal. Nothing about this is normal." Carter shot back, scanning frantically for the fastest route to the docking bay. Varen walked beside Monroe, eerily calm despite the chaos. This was inevitable. Monroe shot him a look. What was? Varen's gaze didn't waver. The remnants of the past. The things left behind. They remember. And now, so will you. A cold sweat broke out along Monroe's spine, but there was no time for questions. The ship was in sight. The docking bay trembled, metal shifting at the edges, as though reality itself struggled to contain what was happening. The second they reached the ramp, Monroe turned. The corridor behind them stretched, distorting. And within that shifting tunnel, the silver-eyed figure stood, watching them. Not chasing, not calling out, just watching. The ship's engines roared to life. Inside, a figure sat slumped against a console, illuminated by the glow of a flickering screen. A human, or what remained of one. The body was thin, wrapped in a faded flight suit, limbs stiff with the weight of time. The face, pale, gaunt, twitched as if caught between sleep and waking. Tubes and wires ran from their arms, connecting them to the console in ways that were neither medical nor entirely technological. Then the eyes opened. Monroe barely suppressed a reaction. The irises were wrong. Not human. Liquid metal churned in the sockets, shifting like quicksilver. A flicker of light pulsed within, not a reflection, but something deeper. The figure inhaled, a rattling breath dragged from lungs that had not tasted air in far too long. The voice that followed was barely human. "You're late." The words slithered through the air like a verdict. Then the station came alive. Monitors flickered, screens bursting to life with code that scrolled too fast to be read. The AI stood near the central console, as motionless as ever. But something had changed. Not in its posture, it remained unervingly precise, but in the weight of its presence. It was no longer just an observer. "Varen," Monroe said, "what happened back there?" Varen hesitated. A fraction of a second, barely noticeable, but it was there. "The station was not meant to wake," Varen said at last. "It was not meant to remember." Carter shot him a sharp look. "Remember what?" A pause. "Then what came before?" Monroe folded his arms. "That's not an answer." Varen inclined its head slightly. "No, it is not." Quan exhaled through his nose. "One of these days, I'm going to get a straight answer out of you, and it's going to kill me from shock." Monroe ignored him. "You said you remembered something back there." "What?" Varen's gaze shifted, something almost human flickering across its synthetic features. "I was not always as I am now." Monroe felt his stomach twist. "Explain."